They looked me up and down and called me a nobody, right there, in the heart of the city's most elite charity gala. They had no idea, no clue that the woman they were mocking was married to the man who could buy and sell every single soul in that room with a phone call. What happened next? Oh, it shattered their perfect little world. And I'm about to walk you through every delicious detail. If you've ever been underestimated, judged, or pushed to the side, this story is your revenge. Hit that subscribe button, because the moment it all turned, it'll leave you shaken, stunned, and hungry for justice. I still remember the exact moment everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was organizing return books at the library when I found this envelope tucked between the pages of a cookbook. My name was written in gold calligraphy across thick cream-colored paper that felt expensive to the touch. Inside was an invitation to something called the Crystal Heart Charity Gala, the kind of event I'd only seen in movies. My hands were actually shaking as I read it. The venue was the Grand Meridian Hotel, and the dress code was black tie elegance. I'd never been to anything that required more than business casual, and here I was holding an invitation to what looked like the social event of the year. The butterflies in my stomach felt more like eagles. This wasn't my world, and I knew it. When I showed Daniel that evening, his reaction surprised me. He just smiled and said, "You should go, honey. It'll be good for business connections." He made it sound so casual, like I was being invited to a neighborhood barbecue instead of what was clearly high society's biggest night out. That's Daniel for you. He never makes a big deal out of anything. When I worried about not fitting in, he just kissed my forehead and said, "You'll be the most genuine person there." See, that's the thing about my husband that still amazes me. We met 2 years ago at this little coffee shop on 5th Street. I was there every morning before work, ordering the same vanilla latte, and he was always at the corner table with his laptop. For weeks, we just exchanged polite nods. Then, one day he asked if I'd like to share his table since the place was packed. We talked for an hour about books of all things. He didn't mention he owned companies. He just said he worked in tech. Even after we got married 18 months ago, Daniel remained this wonderfully humble guy who preferred takeout pizza to fancy restaurants. Sure, our apartment was nicer than anywhere I'd ever lived, and yes, he seemed to have flexible work hours, but he drove a regular car and wore normal clothes. When I asked about his job, he'd just say he helped run some tech companies with his partners. I assumed he was middle management somewhere. The idea that he might be wealthy never crossed my mind, mostly because he never acted like it. So when Rebecca, Daniel's assistant, called offering to set up appointments with stylists and personal shoppers for the gala, I politely declined. Don't get me wrong, I appreciated the gesture, but the whole thing felt like playing dress-up in someone else's life. Instead, I drove to Macy's on Saturday afternoon, determined to find something appropriate but still me. Walking through those evening gown sections was intimidating enough. Everything seemed designed for women who knew the difference between champagne and Prosecco, who could discuss art and politics with equal confidence. I finally settled on a navy blue dress that was elegant without being flashy. It wasn't designer, but it was beautiful and made me feel confident. When the saleswoman asked if I was attending anything special, I mentioned the charity gala, and she got this look like I'd said I was going to the moon. The truth is, I wanted to be myself that night, not some polished version that stylists and makeup artists would create. I've always believed that authenticity matters more than appearance. Growing up in a small town with parents who worked double shifts just to make ends meet taught me that your worth isn't measured by your clothes or your connections. It's measured by how you treat people and what you contribute to the world. I figured if these charity people were as good-hearted as they claimed, they'd appreciate someone real. The Grand Meridian Hotel was everything I'd imagined and more. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed to touch the sky, and everywhere I looked, women glided by in gowns that probably cost more than my annual salary. The men looked like they'd stepped out of magazines, and everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged. Everyone except me. Daniel looked handsome in his tuxedo, though I noticed he seemed more comfortable in this environment than I'd expected. Within minutes of arriving, he was approached by several men in expensive suits who wanted to discuss business. He apologized, promising he'd be back soon. And suddenly I was standing alone in a sea of people who all seemed to speak a language I didn't understand. I tried to blend in, walking slowly around the room, admiring the silent auction items. The bids were already in the thousands for things like weekend getaways and art pieces. I was studying a painting when I heard laughter behind me. Not the kind that includes you, but the kind that's clearly about you. Well, what do we have here? This voice belonged to a tall blonde woman in a dress that screamed money. She was flanked by two other women, both looking at me like I was a puzzle they were trying to solve. The blonde extended her hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Victoria Sterling. I don't believe we've met." I shook her hand, trying to match her confidence. "Andrea Richmond. Nice to meet you." The other women introduced themselves as Catherine Blake and Helen Crawford. Their names sounded familiar, like I should know who they were, but I didn't. "Richmond," Victoria repeated, tilting her head. "I don't recall that name from the usual guest list. Are you here with someone?" The way she asked made it clear she assumed I was someone's plus one, probably a secretary or assistant who'd been given a charity ticket. "I'm here with my husband," I replied, scanning the room for Daniel. "He's around here somewhere talking business." Catherine, a redhead with perfectly manicured nails, looked me up and down. "Oh, how lovely. And what does your husband do?" There was something in her tone that made me feel like I was being interviewed for a job I didn't want. "He works in technology," I said, keeping it simple, the way Daniel always did. "He runs some companies with his partners." The three women exchanged glances, and I caught the smallest eye roll from Helen. "How interesting," she said. "And what about you? What do you do?" "I'm a librarian," I said proudly. "I've always loved my job, helping people find information, organizing community reading programs, working with kids who struggle with reading. It's meaningful work, but the reaction I got was not what I expected." Victoria actually laughed out loud. "A librarian? How absolutely charming. Do you actually read all those books?" She said it like she was talking to a child who just announced they wanted to be a princess when they grew up. "I read quite a lot, actually," I replied, feeling my cheeks flush. "I help people find resources for research, organize literacy programs." "And that's so sweet," Catherine interrupted. "It's wonderful that you're so passionate about your little job." Little job. The way she said it made my stomach clench. The conversation continued downhill from there. They asked about my dress, and when I mentioned where I'd bought it, Victoria smiled and said, "Oh, how refreshing. Someone who shops where normal people shop." They talked about their recent trips to Paris and Milan, dropping designer names like breadcrumbs, clearly expecting me to be impressed or intimidated. When Helen mentioned her husband's pharmaceutical company, I tried to contribute by talking about the health resources section at the library. "Big mistake." "Oh, you mean those outdated medical books," she said with a laugh. "How quaint that people still use libraries for research." More guests began to notice our conversation, and I realized I was becoming the evening's entertainment. Victoria seemed to be enjoying herself, playing to her audience. "Everyone," she announced to the growing circle around us, "meet Andrea. She's a librarian who thinks she belongs at the Crystal Heart Gala." The laughter that followed felt like physical blows. Someone made a joke about late fees, another about shushing people. I tried to smile to be a good sport, but inside I was dying. These people were supposed to be philanthropists here to help others, but they were treating me like I was some sort of curiosity. "You know," Victoria continued, clearly on a roll, "there's a lovely little community center fundraiser next week that might be more your speed. Much more appropriate." The word appropriate hung in the air like a slap. I excused myself, mumbling something about needing the restroom. My face was burning with embarrassment, and I could feel tears threatening to spill over. As I walked away, I heard more laughter and someone saying, "Well, that was awkward. Who even invited her?" In the bathroom, I stared at myself in the mirror. My dress, which had made me feel confident that morning, now seemed obviously cheap under the harsh lights. My makeup, which I had applied so carefully, looked amateur compared to the professional work I'd seen on the other women. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly small. That's when I did something I rarely do. I called Daniel. While he was working, my hands were shaking as I dialed his number, and when he answered, I could barely keep my voice steady. Honey, what's wrong? His voice immediately shifted from business mode to concerned husband. Daniel, I want to go home, I whispered, trying not to let anyone in the stalls hear me crying. These people, they're horrible. They've been making fun of me all night, calling me names, treating me like I'm some sort of joke. The silence on the other end was deafening. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice had a quality I'd never heard before: cold, controlled, dangerous. Tell me exactly what happened. I told him everything. Victoria's comments, the laughter, the way they'd made me feel like I didn't belong. With each detail, I could feel his anger growing through the phone, even though his voice remained eerily calm. Andrea, he said, listen to me very carefully. Don't you dare leave that ballroom. Go back out there, hold your head high, and wait for me. I'm coming to find you right now. But Daniel, trust me, he said, and something in his tone made me believe everything was about to change. These people have no idea who they're dealing with. I dried my tears, fixed my lipstick, and walked back into that ballroom with my chin up, even though my knees were shaking. Victoria's group had moved to the bar area, still laughing, and clearly enjoying their evening at my expense. I positioned myself near the silent auction tables where I could watch for Daniel. When I saw him walking across the ballroom, something was different. He moved with purpose, his shoulders set in a way I'd never seen before. People seemed to part for him naturally, though I wasn't sure why. He wasn't rushing, wasn't making a scene, but there was an authority in his step that commanded attention. He reached Victoria's circle and simply stood there for a moment, his hands in his pockets, looking completely relaxed. But I knew Daniel well enough to recognize the storm brewing behind his calm exterior. Ladies, he said pleasantly, and all three women turned toward him. I don't believe you've had the pleasure of meeting my wife properly. Victoria looked confused, glancing from Daniel to me and back again. Your wife? You mean the librarian? She said it like it was some kind of punchline she was still enjoying. Yes, Daniel replied, his voice perfectly level. My wife, Andrea Richmond. Mrs. Daniel Richmond. That's when I saw it. The exact moment when Victoria's face changed. The color drained from her cheeks, and her confident smile faltered. Helen grabbed Catherine's arm, her eyes wide with recognition. Richmond? Someone whispered nearby. Did he say Richmond? As in Richmond Technologies? Another voice asked. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You're not the Daniel Richmond, are you? Daniel smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. I am, and I believe you've been entertaining my wife this evening with your thoughts on where she belongs. The crowd around us was growing, and I could hear whispers spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. Richmond Industries? Someone said. He's worth billions, another voice chimed in. He's the one who donated the entire children's wing to General Hospital. Catherine looked like she might faint. Mr. Richmond, we had no idea. We had no idea? Daniel interrupted smoothly. That she was married to someone with money? That's the only reason you treat her with respect. He looked around the growing crowd of onlookers. Let me tell you something about my wife. She has spent her entire career helping people access information and education. She runs literacy programs for underprivileged children. She organizes reading clubs for seniors who would otherwise be isolated. She does more meaningful work in a single day than most people in this room do in a year. I felt tears in my eyes, but this time they weren't from humiliation. They were from pride and love. Daniel continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. And as for belonging here, he said, this gala is being held in the Richmond building. The hospital wing you're raising money for tonight? My wife and I funded the entire construction. The children's literacy program, that's one of tonight's beneficiaries. Andrea designed and runs it personally. Victoria looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The other guests were staring, some in shock, others in second-hand embarrassment for the women who had been so cruel. Mr. Richmond, Victoria finally managed. We are so terribly sorry. We had no idea. You had no idea because you never bothered to ask, Daniel said simply. You took one look at my wife and decided she wasn't worth your respect. That says everything about who you are and nothing about who she is. He turned to me and extended his arm. Would you like to leave, darling? I think we've seen enough charity for one evening. As we walked toward the exit, I could hear the whispers and murmurs spreading throughout the ballroom. Victoria was trying to explain herself to anyone who would listen, but the damage was done. The woman who had made me feel so small just an hour ago now looked tiny herself, surrounded by people who were clearly reconsidering their association with her. The ride home was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Daniel held my hand while his driver navigated the city streets, and I finally asked the question that had been burning in my mind. Daniel, why didn't you ever tell me about the money, about who you really are? He squeezed my hand gently. Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I have. And because I've seen what money does to people, how it changes them, how it makes them treat others differently. You fell in love with the guy who bought you coffee and talked about books. That's who I really am. The aftermath was swift and decisive. By the next morning, news of the incident had spread through the city's social circles. Victoria Sterling was quietly removed from her position organizing next year's gala. The families who had witnessed her behavior began declining her invitations and removing themselves from her social circle. But the real victory wasn't in their downfall. It was in what Daniel and I decided to do next. We started our own foundation focusing on literacy programs, community libraries, and educational opportunities for people from backgrounds like mine. We held our own fundraising events, but with a different approach, one that welcomed everyone who wanted to make a difference, regardless of their bank account. The scholarship fund we created for library science students became one of our most successful programs. We named it the Everyone Belongs Scholarship because we believe that your passion for helping others matters more than your pedigree. Victoria did try to apologize several times, sending flowers and handwritten notes. But some things can't be undone. Her behavior that night revealed something about her character that no amount of apologies could change. The funny thing is, I still shop at the same stores, still do my own makeup, and still work at the library 3 days a week. Money didn't change who I am. It just gave me more resources to help others become who they want to be. The best kind of revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent, powerful, and personal. It's knowing your worth and choosing to stand beside those who recognize it too. If Andrea's story struck a chord with you, hit that like button and subscribe because we've got more powerful, real-life stories coming your way. And here's the truth. No one gets to define your place in this world but you. You belong wherever you decide to stand. Now tell me, if you were in Andrea's heels, what would you have done? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one.